that's the way it works. So the more optimal the kidneys are, the more you can genuinely get away with not having a large amount of alkaline foods in your diet.
Yeah, okay, it makes sense. Just like the stronger your liver is, the more you can drink without looking haggard.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So ideally we want to do both, and like I say, I do both. I have alkaline foods every day. Most of my diet is in fact alkaline foods, and I have damaged tonic kidney herbs every day. But my point is simply that for those who do like to go out and consume acidifying substances, I think we should talk about what those are. There's a substantial more leeway to be able to do that if your kidneys are strong and they've had that Jing batteries replaced, rather than if they're depleted. And like if you were in a position where you hadn't been able to have a green juice for a few weeks for whatever reason, like you said you are in that position, then you would feel okay. You see what I mean? Because you have a little bit of that as reserve, rather than feeling a little bit depleted like you say you are, because you don't have that reserve.
Yeah,
because
and
I have a
then
client.
going back to coffee because I feel depleted, and then sticking myself more and thinking, oh god, I just need a green juice.
So remind me about
Nightmare.
coffee in a second, but I just want to say as well, just to finish that thought off, I had a client who was actually a nutritional expert, and she was consuming sort of large amounts of green foods, and she'd been doing so for I think 10 years maybe, something like that, and she still wasn't having that acid alkaline balance. She still felt that she constantly had to have all these alkaline things rather than was doing it because it was optimal. Otherwise she'd get thrown off balance again. So I just want to make that point that from my experience, no matter how optimally you eat and no matter how much green alkaline food you consume, you're never going to totally restore balance just by doing that. There needs to be something else. You need to tonify the kidneys. You need to replace the Jing energy and strengthen them so that their job of doing that is a hell of a lot easier.
Also, that brings me to perfect question actually, because it's all about the balance with the acid and the alkaline, and we have been talking because it's very prevalent that the people are too acidic as opposed to alkaline. However, you do get people on the other side of the scale, and I know a few, and that ability to keep them in balance is what the herbs do best.
Definitely, yeah.
Because, I mean, you said earlier about leaky kidneys. I don't know if you can elaborate on maybe the symptoms of that, but from what I've seen, it's someone who's... the openness is taken to a point where it's just completely draining.
Absolutely.
So it's just very emotional.
So,
crying about this and drama about that. And
yeah, they tend to have a lot of things in common. Someone who has sort of this leaky kidney syndrome, as we call it. I'm sure there's a more proper word, but I can't recall it, so we'll call it that.
Doctors call things leaky gut. I'm sure we can get away with leaking kidneys.
So exactly as you say, they tend to be overwhelmed very easily. They tend to be very emotional, very emotionally demonstrative. They tend to not have clear boundaries. This is another thing. They tend to very easily forget that. They tend to have a great problem reining in or having control over their instincts, whether that be sexual instincts or instincts to eat or drink or instincts to power or dominance. So things will just tend to get away from them, and they'll just tend to act in an automated manner, and then later go, oh god, what did I do, you know. From a more biophysical point of view, they tend to urinate quite frequently. If they're hot, then they'll tend to sweat a lot, although that's not necessarily going to be the case. If they're cool temperamented, then they're not. They tend to be quite thirsty sort of people as well, if they're hot sort of temperamented. Yeah, those are some of the main things I look for that. Now I want to take issue with you about this thing you said about people being overly alkaline. I don't really believe that that exists in our modern culture. I have heard of talk of it. I think if someone lives, say, out in the middle of the mountains, like a hermit, and lives in with nature and doesn't really have any challenges because they've got everything nicely set up and they can just be like a lot of people on a spiritual path may be inclined to live, then there's a possibility of becoming overly alkaline, but I'd say it virtually doesn't exist. Now, what you're talking about, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is probably a different phenomenon, and that's one I kept meaning to address, but we'll address it properly now, which is the issue of drugs, particularly stimulants. So there's two things that go on when someone takes a drug. One of them is that they have a blood sugar spike followed by a crash, and that is one of the reasons why people are tempted to have drugs. Now this blood sugar spike and crash relates to this Jing energy being released. So let me just clarify what I mean by drugs. I mean sugar, I mean coffee, I mean cigarettes, I mean cannabis, all the other hallucinogens like that, like mescaline, ayahuasca, whatever it may be. I mean all the chemical drugs like MDMA, cocaine, and I mean, to be honest, most of the pharmaceutical drugs like Prozac, warfarin, all the rest of it. All these drugs, what they all have in common is that the active ingredients which makes them work is something called an alkaloid, right? Different from alkaline, alkaloid, but similar, because an alkaloid is a substance found in all foods, including healthy foods as well, by the way. Just to be technically accurate, you'll find it in spinach and rocket and parsley as well. But active alkaloids, which produce a profound state of consciousness, like a coffee or even a cigarette does, at least when you first have it, they temporarily alkalize you, and the alkaline state they produce is often quite extreme. It's extremely alkaline, followed by...
Particularly when you're... Because people who generally crave for these things are particularly acid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, good point, exactly right. So when you're particularly... You're absolutely right, let's start at the beginning. So if someone is particularly acidic, they are going to be compelled beyond their will, okay, to consume an alkaloid. They're really not going to have much choice about the matter,
Yeah.
okay? They're going to want a coffee or a cigarette or a line of Coke or, you know, whatever it is.
Split after work.
Whatever it is in your world that's socially acceptable, you know, I mean, different classes, different groups will have their own alkaloids of choice that's okay, and alkaloids which are not cool to have. Sugar and alcohol are a little bit of an exception, actually. They're just acid forming, so they don't fall into this category. But everything else does. Okay. Drug and so sugar and alcohol are drugs, and they do produce this blood sugar spike. So they do waste Jing energy, but they're not an alkaloid. But pretty much every other drug you can think of is an alkaloid. So almost every drug falls into this category. So yeah, you're in a very acidic state. You're also very drained because you're on this negative cycle of energy, so you're probably exhausted. So then you consume a substance, and let's just talk about coffee or cigarettes because they're the most prevalent. So you have a coffee or you have a cigarette.
Or both.
Or both. And what happens is you have a blood sugar surge because you've just released a little bit of Jing energy. Let's talk about how that works quickly, actually, before we go to alkaloids. So how does a stimulant actually work? Why does it stimulate? Good question, right?
Yeah.
So a stimulant works basically because it is a poison.
Okay.
So basically, you take in a poison, and your body, unsurprisingly, reacts with alarm.
Why are you poisoning me? What are you doing? Yeah.
So what your body does when it has any poison in is it will release adrenaline, and it will basically burn this poison off somewhere, and it will attempt to excrete it, remove it as quickly as possible, by whatever means. If it's severe enough, it'll be by throwing up, it may try and excrete it via the urine, it may try and sweat it out, you know, they're all different ways, but whatever, it's basically just trying to get it out as quickly as possible by whatever means it deems most appropriate, depending on the situation, right? So that's what goes on every time you have a puff of a cigarette or a sip of a cup of coffee. Some little statistics which help to back this up is if you consumed the amount of caffeine in your average Starbucks double espresso latte, and you had that amount of caffeine injected into your bloodstream, you would die instantly.
Same with a cigarette with nicotine, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly right. Yes. So this kind of proves that these substances are poison. The only reason that we don't die straight away when we consume them is because it takes time to process, and because it's a slow release, your body can just deal with a little chunk at a time, rather than if you were to inject it all into the bloodstream, it would be overwhelmed and it can cope. Okay. Having said that, like some people point out to me when I say this, anything can kill you. Sure, water can kill you if you drink too much of it. Potassium, which is a valuable mineral, can kill you. That's how they kill people with lethal injection.